what you're seeing. So I'm Warren Brown. I'm at the Travis Research Institute at Fuller Graduate School of Psychology in Pasadena. I'm here with 5 of my grad students, and we're thinking about research, interacting with you. So if you want to participate in research, or your family member maybe would like to participate, 2 of my grad students are there. Raise your hands. So they're at a table out there. So that's announcement number 1. Announcement number 2 is that how we'll do question and answer is on Hula. So if you go to agenda and go to this talk and tap it, you'll see Q&A. Go to Q&A and put your questions there. Then when we come to the end, I will be answering your questions. So, I got a picture. So let's see. So there we go, it's working. So let me just give you a little bit of outline of what I'm going to be talking about. I'm going to start with some very basics about the corpus callosum and agenesis of the corpus callosum. I've done this talk before. You may have been in this session in the past. This will be very basic and the kind of things I've talked about in the past. Then I want to talk about the core syndrome of agenesis of the corpus callosum, which is some work that Dr. Lynn Paul and I did, kind of summarizing what we think we had found over 25 years of research on agenesis of the corpus callosum. Then I'm going to talk about elaborative thinking in agenesis of the corpus callosum. That is our kind of newest way of thinking about the nature of what kind of core disabilities are a part of callosal absence. And then I'm going to talk about everyday outcomes. All right. So first, to the very basics. I'm going to talk about just what is a corpus callosum, then we'll talk about what is agenesis of the corpus callosum. A lot of you know this, but just so that we're all on the same page, we'll kind of go through this and make sure, you know, we all know what agree on what we're talking about, and then we'll go on to some other things. I better stand back from the corner. I'm going to fall. Rats. All right, there we go. We got a delay here. It's going forward rather than backward. Can you take me? Yeah, that's it. I guess I'm going to have to tell you to advance the slide. So what is the corpus callosum? There is it's the sort of the connective pathway between the right and left cerebral cortex. And there is a nice slide of the anatomy of the corpus callosum. So down here at the bottom, you see, wait, go backwards. Can you go back a slide? Sorry, go back. There it is. Stay right there. So you see at the bottom a view of a brain. The nose is right down there in the front. The ears would be on the side. And if you were able to section that brain and look at what you were seeing there, it would look like what's up here at the top. So, oops. This is really getting confused. Can you advance that slide for me? Just there we go. Just leave it right there. You would see this, and you have a right hemisphere, a right side of the brain on your left because you're looking at the person, and a left hemisphere. And the gray matter is actually in kind of a orange here. It's that dark around the side of the cerebral cortex, the cerebral gray matter. And then the light kind of yellow in there is the white matter. The gray matter is the cells and the interconnections between the cells. And the white matter is the axons that are coming out, sending information to other parts of the brain. All right. And part of that white matter is fibers that actually cross the midline. Here it's blown up for you. And so axons from the right hemisphere going to the left and from the left hemisphere going to the right are passing through the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum is a conduit for information going from the right cerebral hemisphere to the left cerebral hemisphere. So shall I do the next slide or can you hear? Okay. So this is another view that I like. Up at the top is a midline view. So if you section the right down the midline and looked at the mid-sagittal part, the nose would be up here and the ears here, and there's a cross section of that big conduit that's going from the right to the left. And and then down at the bottom is looking down from the top. And I really like this drawing because it emphasizes the massive interconnectivity of the right and left cerebral hemispheres that is going through the corpus callosum. So that cross section of the corpus callosum is going like that there, and that's what you see up there. So, well, we're not. This isn't working right. That's what I was. Those. So you see circled in red at the top. The purple area says the corpus callosum, and then at the bottom I put in the arrows that emphasize the fact how much information is going through the corpus callosum from the right side to the left. So what does the corpus callosum do? Very simply, it transfers information, as you would expect, between the right cerebral hemisphere and the left cerebral hemisphere. In a minute, I'll show you a little bit about what information one side of the brain is going to have that the other is not going to have and needs to be shared through the corpus callosum. Second thing it does is integrates the mental processing of the two hemispheres. So things are being processed in the right hemisphere and the left, and these need to be integrated, and that integration occurs through the corpus callosum. And then that integration is critical for certain mental processes, but I have in question mark what mental processes, and we have spent 25 years trying to nail down what mental processes are the corpus callosum is important for and which ones are not as important for, that you can do those mental processes quite well without a corpus callosum, but you can't do those or can't do them quite as well. So that's where the big question mark is, and we've spent 25 years focusing on that. So the basis of our research, really historically, is the work of Nobel laureate Roger Sperry. Roger Sperry is at Caltech, which is just down the road from where I am at Fuller. And at one point in my career, when I was finishing my doctoral work, I had a chance to do a postdoc with Roger Sperry, but it was a half-time postdoc. And there was another one at UCLA that was a full-time. So Roger Sperry hadn't won the Nobel Prize at that point, and so I took the full-time postdoc. And I always wonder what my career would have been like had I taken a postdoc with Nobel laureate or eventually Nobel laureate Roger Sperry. But Roger Sperry's work is very much background to our understanding of agenesis of the corpus callosum, because Roger Sperry was working with a surgical split brain. So for a while, and they still do this somewhat differently now than they did back in the 1960s and 70s, but you cut the corpus callosum surgically in order to prevent the spread of epilepsy from one hemisphere to the other hemisphere. And so actually was a fairly successful treatment for grand mal seizures. But at the same time, Sperry described the nature of the activity or processing going on the left hemisphere as it was different from what goes on in the right hemisphere. So some of the things you can see here is, first of all, one of the differences between what's happening in the hemisphere is the tactile and visual and other kind of information available. So the right hemisphere over here has information about the left hand. Stereognosis is your ability to figure out what something is just by touching it. And so that kind of touch information from the left hand is in the right cerebral hemisphere. Also, information from the left visual field is in the right cerebral hemisphere, so you have a crossing of activity. And then the right hand is processed and information going to the left hemisphere, as well as the right visual field of the left hemisphere. So to start with, there is some lateralized separate information available in one hemisphere that is not available to the other hemisphere, except going through the corpus callosum. But also, it's true that the left, and this is what Sperry spent a lot of time describing, was the left hemisphere is the main language center, and also center for language-like activities like math and calculations. And then the right cerebral hemisphere is more specialized for spatial constructions, it says simple language there, but actually the sort of more diffuse semantic networks we have around language meaning are constructed to some degree in the right cerebral hemisphere. And then non-verbal ideation, kind of spatial thinking is more present in the right than the left hemisphere. So again, at a higher level than just vision and touch, you have some information processing going on in the two cerebral hemispheres that need to be coordinated and integrated through the corpus callosum. Now, I got involved in this work working with Malcolm Jeeves at the University of St. Andrews. Malcolm is a very good friend of mine. He's now 95 and doing quite well, and he and I communicate by emails every now and then, but I got introduced, Malcolm Jeeves had been studying agenesis of the corpus callosum many years ago, where people did not get MRIs, and therefore it took a ventriculogram, which is a heroic process to figure out whether a person maybe had agenesis, but you couldn't look at an MRI. But anyway, Malcolm had been doing work on agenesis of the corpus callosum for a number of years when he and I got meeting each other and becoming friends and starting to work together. And so that I put ACC as sort of the natural split brain. It's much like the outcome of the surgical split brain, but it is different, but it has its parallels. So a lot of the work Malcolm Jeeves did and Malcolm and I did, and my students and I have done, so have their roots in the early work of Sperry. So definition of agenesis, that moves us now from the corpus callosum generally to the idea of agenesis. This you all know, this is part of your life, but let's just put it out there. First of all, it's a congenital brain abnormality. It occurs prior to birth, probably at the end of the first trimester, beginning of the second trimester of prenatal development. Agenesis means without development. For some reason, the corpus callosum didn't develop or developed only partially. Part or all of the corpus callosum then fails to develop. And it can occur by itself, or it can occur along with other congenital brain abnormalities. So I'll cover that a little bit more in a minute. Got a delay here. And it can also be the primary abnormality, and the difference between ACC as a primary abnormality and ACC along with other things is an important in our way we set up our research. So there are three forms then. This you know for sure, because you all know this nomenclature. There's complete ACC, that is no part of the corpus callosum developed. Partial ACC, a portion is present, but not all. And then hypoplasia, which the whole thing is there lengthwise, but it's underdeveloped and thin. So let me just illustrate the cerebral commissures and the nature of ACC this way. So the corpus callosum is 200 million neurons. We've seen this in that purple slide. Axons coursing from the right side to the left side. But there's also an anterior commissure, which is not the corpus callosum, but it does have axons that send information from the right side to the left. But there's only about 50,000 axons. Most people, not all, but most people with agenesis of the corpus callosum have an anterior commissure. So they're sort of like this. We've got the partial up there. So they have an anterior commissure there, like that, an anterior commissure, but no corpus callosum. So there's not like nothing is going back and forth, but just a limited amount of information that can course across the thing like the anterior commissure. And then partial has some part of that 200 million neurons. Where is it? There we go. And I put a question mark there because, first of all, partial comes in many forms. We'll see that in a minute. Secondly, we actually don't know very well what the fibers that are present in partial are actually contributing to cognitive processes. So the difference between a complete and partial, in most cases, escape us in the things we're looking at in our research. They just seem to be very overlapping in their outcome. So here's the way this looks in MRI. On the right is a mid-sagittal MRI of a person who is normal. That's normal in quotes because that's my MRI, and we don't know for sure whether I am normal. So, you know, there's my corpus callosum there in the little red circle when it comes up. There's mine. On the right is a person with agenesis or absence of the corpus callosum, and you can see in the red circle that white structure that looks like the head of a hammer is just not present. So now you're all certified neuroradiologists, and you can diagnose agenesis of the corpus callosum because it's hard to miss. So there's another version of a person with agenesis, and you can see in the red circle the absence of the corpus callosum. But you can see in the little white, see that little white dot? That's the anterior commissure. So the anterior commissure is present, this tiny little fiber pathway. The big cross section of the corpus callosum is just not present. So again, it's not like there's nothing coursing back and forth between the cerebral cortex on the right and left, just a limited amount. And part of our question research-wise is what can be done over the anterior. I talked about partial. There's a person with partial. You see that little white element that is some part of the corpus callosum. There's another person with partial. We'll get to it in a minute. We went backwards. There's another person with partial, and you can see that a lot of the corpus callosum is there in that individual, but not all of it. So the one thing about partial ACC is there's a lot of varieties with respect to how much of the corpus callosum is there and how much of it is missing. So we use two terminologies. This terminology kind of from my lab. We talk about isolated ACC. Actually, you'll find that term in the literature to some degree. And it means the corpus callosum is absent only, but there's not other abnormalities visible on the MRI outside of just absence of the corpus callosum. And then we talk about ACC plus, which is absence of the corpus callosum, but other brain developmental abnormalities also present. And the person with isolated ACC are often a little bit higher functioning, those with ACC plus. The other cerebral abnormalities often contribute to greater difficulties functioning and kind of function at somewhat lower level. And so we've set up our research, taking that into account. As two possible outcomes. Isolated ACC that we just saw, we think it has what you might consider outcome A. So what is the outcome of just absence of the corpus callosum without other developmental brain abnormalities? And what we call ACC plus, this is terminology we sometimes use in the lab, which you might consider to be outcome A and B. That is, A is the absence of the corpus callosum, B is what has contributed to that person's profile and behavior and cognition, also by not only absence of the corpus callosum, but by their other brain abnormalities. And we've tried to focus our research on isolated ACC and what was in that slide, outcome A. So I want to talk now about the core syndrome of ACC. We blasted past the slide. This is not working well. And I want to use a computer metaphor for you to understand also what I'm talking about and what we talk about in our core syndrome. So that if you have two computers, this is jumping all over the place. If you had two computers and you gave them a process of a problem to solve, each computer would solve the problem at the same speed and whatever amount of processing it do. If you connected the two computers by a small bus, you could actually get some improvement, depending on the way the software was operating, in the speed and power for computing, because the two computers are connected by a bus, a small bus. If you connected them by a very robust multi-channel bus, then you have two computers that work together in a way that gives you greater processing power and faster processing speed because they're well connected. Well, my metaphor here is the corpus callosum is like a big information processing bus between two computers, the right cerebral hemisphere and the left. And so when that bus is absent, you don't process with the same power and you don't process with the same speed. So I think that's at least somewhat descriptive or metaphorically descriptive of the nature of agenesis of the corpus callosum, which comes into then what Lynn, Paul, and I we sat down about 3 or 4 years ago and said, okay, after this 25 years of research, how could we summarize what we think the core problems are in persons without a corpus callosum, with a sort of isolated ACC? What does this lead to? So the basic diagnosis is agenesis of the corpus callosum, and that leads to 3 core syndromes.
Yes.
Core symptoms. One is limited interhemispheric transfer. Information just does not get from one side of the brain to the other side of the brain, or most information. Second is, and this comes very much from our computer metaphor, slow cognitive processing. So cognitive processing speed slows down, and deficient processing of complex novel tasks. It's just harder to deal with a new and complex task. The processing power just it takes longer to get there in processing the information, slower and less robust. And then we think, then the way we thought about this is that that then leads to secondary symptoms. We just call them secondary, and that they're not a part of what we kind of thought was the course symptoms, but those core symptoms operate together in a whole lot of different contexts to give us various outcomes, and you see that we all look at, pay attention to, and notice. So let me talk about limited interhemispheric transfer. We can get through these slides here. Well, so this is supposed to come up one at a time. This is a thing called a tactile performance test. It's a board, and it has little slots, and in each slot is a different shaped block. And it's a test you do blindfolded, and all the blocks are in front of you, and the board is there, and you have to blindfolded feel one block and find where it goes in the board, and you do it all. And we have people do it with their first, with the initial hand, with their dominant hand. And then remaining blindfolded, when they're done, you take all the blocks out, you put the blocks on the table again, and you have them do it now with their non-dominant hand. And the question is, can they do it faster with a non-dominant hand, taking advantage that all that was learned by the other hemisphere when doing it with their dominant hand? Remember, each hemisphere controls one hand separately. And if you have savings, that is, if you can do it faster with the second time with your non-dominant hand, that's index of a whole lot of spatial information going back and forth between the hemispheres. But if it takes you just as long to do it with your non-dominant hand as it took you to do it with your dominant hand, then there wasn't any or very little interhemispheric transfer of information because the corpus callosum is not present. So the outcome here somewhere is illustrated in this graph. This is the savings. This is how much faster or you did it with your non-dominant hand the second time. And for the 10 block, there's two versions of this, 6 block and 10 block. You see very little savings. That is, the person with ACC took just about as long to do it with a non-dominant hand as it did with a dominant. Whereas a person with a corpus callosum does it much faster with their non-dominant hand the second time because information had passed. That's interhemispheric transfer. And so we can demonstrate this in a whole lot of different contexts and with different tests. But it illustrates the fact that information is not coursing back and forth between the right and left cerebral hemispheres because of the absence of the corpus callosum. Backwards there. So the second core symptom is slow cognitive processing time. So when information isn't going back and forth, it just takes a lot longer or measurably longer time to solve a problem than it would with a corpus callosum. So if you look at the basic intelligence test, there we go, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, and that is a very complex test, and you can take that test and calculate 4 different indices. On the left, the verbal comprehension index, and the next value is the perceptual organization index, both of which are pretty much in the normal range. Then the working memory index, and that's pretty much in the normal range. And the last one is the processing speed index. And the processing speed index within the context of the Wechsler test is the one that's most noticeably low in individuals with agenesis of the corpus callosum. So that's it. We've seen this in a lot of different contexts. Another context is a thing called the the word color interference test on this. The DCAFS is a major multi-test battery. And if you look at this test, there are 3 different ways or 3 different challenges in this test. One is to just read words, and they're color words. So that would be like in the top. So you would just read and you time how long it took them to read the card, you know, red, blue, green, red, blue, red, and so forth. All right. All right, next challenge, you just actually name colors. So you have the little color block there, and to do it right, you would say red, blue, green, red, blue, red, so forth. The challenging part is the one at the bottom, in which you're to name the color of the ink and ignore the word, which is hard to do. So that first one is in blue ink, and you're supposed to say blue, but the word is red. And to inhibit the tendency to say red and to name the color of the ink is a hard thing, and it takes a lot of what's called executive control. We gave this test primarily interested in the ability to do that last version indicative of executive functioning. Mostly what we found, and you time each one of those, oops. So mostly what we found is regardless whether it was color naming, word reading, or that inhibition version, and then there's another version of that that I didn't show you, that this is a scaled score. So the big red bars show a normal amount of time, a very fast ability to do the word reading or the color naming. The blue bars show that the scale scores for the individuals with ACC were lower in below the normal range, and therefore slower. And it just turned out that no matter whether they're just reading or naming colors or during the interference part of that, the most important outcome of this test was just slowed processing. Didn't make any difference which one of those 3 they were doing. They just did it more slowly than the persons with a corpus callosum. So that was a very, strong indication of the importance of slow processing speed. Can we go on here? And the last one is complex novel problem solving. I'll illustrate this in 2 ways. One is there are 2 versions of intelligence tests. One is the one we saw before, the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, and it's mostly a test of accumulated knowledge. And it's called crystallized intelligence. That is, this is stuff you just know, and you can bring it out in the Wechsler Intelligence Scale. But, see it, oops, well. Anyway, the bar on the left, it's a group of persons with ACC and their percentile score on the Wechsler crystallized intelligence version of an intelligence test. The second one is the Raven's progressive matrices, and this is a test of stuff you've never done before. There are these geographic figures, and they kind of progress, and you need to pick out which little figure goes in that line of figures, and it's all complex, novel problem solving. And then you can see in the same group of individuals, the outcome on the Raven's progressive matrices. That's the Wechsler test. Somehow we're going backwards. Oops. The Raven's progressive matrices is they have a lower percentile score in that version of intelligence test, which is fluid intelligence. It's new problem solving. So new problem solving highlights difficulties in ACC that are not seen in a test of just things you accumulate knowing over the long haul. This is taking a little longer than we thought, so I'm going to pass this one up. Not try to explain that. Letter number series is complex problem solving for sure. Come on. sort. Those individuals with, on the letter number series, we demonstrated individuals with agenesis of the corpus callosum have problems during that test. So this, we think, feeds in, these basic problems feed into a lot of recognizable problems that we see in the sort of everyday functioning of individuals with agenesis of corpus callosum. So some of the secondary symptoms are things like inadequate encoding of new complex memories. When it's actually effortful, and to remember something that's complex, you have to kind of process it in your mind so that you remember it. If you don't process it quite as well, as quickly, as robustly in your mind, you may not remember it later. And so parents, it's not that they weren't paying attention. They were paying attention. They just didn't process that deeply enough to remember it later. Problems utilizing previous information and sequential problem-solving tasks. There's a lot of problem-solving tasks where you need to use this previous information to solve this next part. And you need to use that information to solve the next part, and moving that information forward is often difficult. Difficulty understanding secondary meaning of language. That's really an important one. So think about what is conveyed and important in social interaction in non-literal expressions, things that people say that you're not supposed to take literally. You're actually, it's some kind of an idiom or metaphor. Also proverbs, jokes, humor often rely on non-literal language processing, and they have a difficult time doing non-literal language processing. Problems understanding subtle aspects of social interactions, some of it related to that problem with secondary language, but also recognizing the current situation with respect to what went before, what will happen after. And so I'll talk a little more about that in a minute. And the difficulty imagining the consequences of possible actions. Okay, so the most recent work we've done over the last 2 to 3 years, probably 4 years, is to look at elaborative processing. And this was an interesting journey for us. So the first thing we paid attention to as we had a test of social inferences that involved watching animations and then telling us what you saw. So I'll show you this animation. You have it running there. Go ahead and show it. Watch the animation on the right, the one called Theory of Mind. We won't show you the other two. What you are to do is just tell what you saw. So we got this test from work that is done in autism, and individuals with autism will tell you about the movement of the triangles and the touching and whatever, but don't infer the human, social, interactive kinds of things that are demonstrated there with the little triangle and the big triangle interacting and the door opening and whatever. They tell you a much more concrete story than persons with a normal corpus callosum. And well, with the person without autism in this case. And so we were interested in how this came out in individuals with agenesis of the corpus callosum. So we have these stories they tell after each animation. And there are 4 of them that are complex like that. There are other ones that are not as complex, random and goal directed. We won't talk about those. So what we did most recently was a computational linguistic process called topic modeling. So you can take a person's expression and break it down into semantic topics. And then you can compare the topics used by this person's expression with the topics used by some other person's expression and get a measure of whether they're similar or different. So what we did is we took all the people with the corpus callosum and took their stories and created one big document that was all of their stories all together and got what we thought we imagined to be sort of the core story told by persons with a corpus callosum. And that was our reference point. And then we compared that topic to the topic model from a number of individuals with agenesis of the corpus callosum. How did their story relate to this core story? And then we had a group of individuals with autism spectrum disorder. And so we asked, how did their story compare to the core story? And then, of course, the individuals that went into the core story, we took them one by one and compared them to the core story. This is an instance in which I had a hypothesis and I couldn't have been more wrong. I thought that because of the social difficulties of persons with ACC, they would tell stories that were not like the core story. They would tell some other story. And that the individuals with the corpus callosum would just tell the core story. And so we had this measure, the measure there is a measure called perplexity. It's how different is it? And so there's the comparison is perplexity. And so here is the outcome. And we have the outcome here somewhere. So the blue bars are the persons with a corpus callosum. They are very different. The higher the bar, the more different they are from the core story. The shorter the bar, the more like the core story they are. So it turns out, much to my surprise, and very statistically significant, this is the most powerful difference we've seen statistically in the lab, the persons with ACC and the persons with autism just told the core story and that was it. And the persons with a corpus callosum told a more elaborative story. They had a lot more to say about what was going on in those interactions and imagined and inferred and elaborated on the core story in ways that persons without a corpus callosum or person with agenesis weren't. So this got me really focused on the idea of difficulty in elaborative, imaginative thinking without a corpus callosum. That what the corpus callosum contributing very importantly is our ability to do these imaginative elaborations. So, you know, I was so wrong at that. We thought we had other data that we could test this. So we did what's called the thematic apperception test. This was data hanging around the lab. This is a picture. Here's 2 of the pictures. We use 6 different pictures. You look at this picture and then your instructions are, I would like you to tell a story with a beginning, middle, and end, and tell me what the characters are thinking, feeling, and doing. So you look at the picture and you tell a story. All right. And so we have this data, and well, if that was true on those animations, it should be true here. And it was very much true. So here we had same methodology we used before, except we didn't have a autism group. We just had a group with ACC and a group of control individuals, concatenated all their stories for each card into a kind of core story and then compared each individual to the core story. And again, we got very exactly the same thing. And again, with this incredibly strong statistical power. So the blue bars are the individuals with the corpus callosum. The red bars are people with the genesis of corpus callosum. The difference between that core story we calculated and the individual story was very much greater for people with a corpus callosum. They told all kinds of things about those cards. The persons with agenesis just didn't tell. They just pretty much focused on that. Yes. Well, let me give that, actually, the next slide exactly answers that question. So we did a different kind of semantic analysis, which was counting words in different categories. And how many words in these categories was used by people with ACC and used by people with corpus callosum. So emotion and feelings, characters, people with ACC did not talk much about the emotions and feelings. They did not talk about the mental processing of the characters. They didn't infer things that they were thinking. They just didn't talk much about that. And they didn't talk much about the social interaction. They didn't elaborate and infer as much social information. So I'm thinking, go back to that syndrome. I'm thinking that elaborative thinking has got to be somewhere in that core symptomatology, because I now think that difficulty elaborating. I'll tell you one other story. When I was the surgeon that did the split brain surgeries on the persons with epilepsy that Roger Sperry studied was a guy named Joe Bogan. And Bogan wrote an article back in the 1960s. He had not much data for this argument at all, but the paper was called The Corpus Callosum and Creativity. And creativity is a version of elaborative inferential thinking. And so I now think that Lynn, Paul, and I actually wrote a paper recently called The Corpus Callosum and Creativity, based on that and referencing Bogan's original thinking. But I think that is at least one level of description of the kind of mental processing that is difficult to do without a corpus callosum. Where are we going here? Oh, so let's just get it all there. So we talked about problem solving earlier, but complex problem solving takes a certain amount of imagination about what are the possibilities and what is this like, and that really takes a certain amount of elaborative thought. You need to think beyond exactly what's in front of you in order to solve a complex problem. But that imagination is also what plays into creativity. So I think that's kind of related topics that are illustrated by this work with the topic modeling, the animations test, and the thematic apperception test. How are we doing on time? We're 3 minutes, 30 minutes. Good. Okay. So everyday outcomes. So the most recent thing we published is a paper on the Can we go back one? One more? There we go. It's the adaptive behavior adaptive behavior analysis scale. Anyway, it's called the ABAS. It's a scale that people rate on themselves and their ability to do things in various adaptive categories: conceptual things, social things, and practical things. And we not only had the person with ACC fill it out, but in every case we got an observer, that is somebody that's close to mom or dad or a brother or sister, older brother or sister or something, to also fill out the scale. And we were really, part of what we're interested in is how much insight the person with ACC has in terms of their adaptive behavior. So the blue are the participant score, the persons with ACC, and it's up there, the sort of norms, the dotted red line, they're up there towards the normal range. They pretty much perceive themselves to be adaptively functioning in the normal range. And you'll see that the individuals that were the observers had a little bit lower estimate of the ability of these individuals to do adaptive things in life. So, you know, all of this, I think, first of all, translates into problems in everyday life with various kinds of adaptivity, depending on whether adaptation range takes rapid processing or complex processing or elaborative imagination. And you know, to the degree that it pushes on those capacities, they are less adaptive in their behavior, but they also don't exactly process all of their situations well enough to recognize the degree to which they're having a little problem in some area that a parent may recognize, but the person with ACC doesn't recognize or doesn't recognize as well.
So you assume, you don't want to say assume, but so you felt that the observers were more accurate in their measurement, or
what this shows is the persons with ACC, well, we don't know about accuracy. We do know about estimates. So the persons with ACC give a higher estimate of their ability to function in the area than a person close to them that knows them well, that can rate their behavior, accurate, adaptive behavior. By the way, use the app to ask questions. I'm going to go to that right in just a minute. I want to, in terms of everyday functioning, this always reminds me of a quote by a philosopher named Alistair McIntyre. Whoops. In a book called Dependent Rational Animals. And if you want to read a philosophical view of disabilities, Alistair McIntyre is a really good read. And in that book is this quote. He writes, "For it is a common assumption that blindness, deafness, deformed or injured limbs, and the like, such as agenesis of the corpus callosum, exclude the sufferer from more than a very, very limited set of possibilities. And this has often been treated as if it were a fact of nature. What is thereby obscured is that the extent to which the obstacles presented by these afflictions, like agenesis of the corpus callosum, can be overcome or circumvented depends not only on the resources of the disabled person, but also on what others contribute. Others whose failures may be failures of imagination with respect to future possibilities." What disability amounts to, that is, depends not just on the disabled individuals, but the groups of which that individual is a member. And NODCC is one of those groups that they can be a member of that expands their possibilities in life. All right, so this work is done by myself and my students at Travis Institute, and along very close collaboration with Dr. Lynn Paul at Caltech, and in conversation with the IRC5, which is the International Research Consortium on the Corpus Callosum and Cerebral Connectivity. Don't try to remember that. IRC5 is good. And then groups that we interact with, like NODCC and LSTOC and Corpal and other parts of the world. So, all right. So now I probably will need my grandson to help me figure this out, but I will process as best I can your questions. So if you have questions, there's a QA under this. So Oops. What advancements in technology like Neuralink? Is there anything similar to the works that could help bridge the connection for ACC down the road? That is really an interesting question. I have a former student who has quadriplegia, has a lifetime of quadriplegia. He's now in a research process at Caltech where they've implanted Neuralink electrodes into his brain, and he's able to sit there and think about movements and control an artificial arm in order to do things like pick up a cup and bring it in. So that is amazing enough to me that I don't know how to speculate about that. That in terms of therapies, that's probably where we're going to go because we can't regrow the corpus callosum. So that is at least imaginable, but I don't know where we're going to end up with that. My nephew has gray matter heterotopia. Can you explain what that means? In the developmental process, cells arrange themselves neatly into that cerebral cortex underlying white matter, and heterotopia is areas, usually not the whole brain, but areas in the brain where that organization is not typical. What it means cognitively, I don't know. If heterotopia is a major additional finding, we probably wouldn't include that person in our research. Small areas of heterotopia, we might go ahead and say, oh, let's see how that person performs. So it's not something we've studied, it's something we pay attention to in case, if it's fairly extensive, we may want to exclude that person. If you're going to ask a question out, you're going to have to say it loud.
About the corpus callosum, do the connoisseurs of the brain work harder?
Well, I think the answer is yes, in the sense that an individual faced with a adaptive challenge of some kind is going to be working hard to figure out how to do that. If their cognitive processing time is slower or less powerful, as we suggest.
The brain stall. You're working too hard or concentrating too hard.
I don't know that I would frame it that way. I don't know that it stalls or stops or anything. I think we notice persons with ACC sometimes in a point of perplexity, that they're kind of frozen because they're not exactly sure what to do next. And so one mother in this conference telling me about her son kind of looks at her with blank eyes for a while. I told her, I think he's just, things are happening slowly, and it's taken him a while to catch up with what's going on in order. And so processing it's moved back into just cognitive systems and not immediately connected with you because there's a lot going on that they're working hard to process.
Thank you.
Let's see. Are large ventricles a characteristic of complete ACC? Yes. That's called colpocephaly, and it's thought to be benign in terms of cognition, that what has happened when you don't have the corpus callosum form and it's not there, something has to take up the space. And so the ventricles, particularly the posterior ventricles, get a little larger just because there's space. So it's really not a problem worth focusing on particularly. So you'll sometimes see colpocephaly or enlarged ventricles as an issue. So I often run into many NODCC Zoom calls, including the very important grandparent call. Now, I always tell them about the anterior commissure and what it does, but I often describe it. It's in the back. I see in your technical technology, not technically in the back. Yeah, it's the anterior commissure, which means up front, or sort of up front and underneath. How should you describe it to families? Yeah, I would say it's called anterior commissure because it's front. I think the idea that something like 50,000 fibers rather than 200 million fibers is an important kind of index of what might be the capacity of the anterior commissure versus the capacity of the corpus callosum to transmit information. The anterior commissure is connecting important areas in the brain in the anterior area, and that has some very sophisticated kind of information. So it's connected up strategically. It's just not a very robust fiber. So a lot of what we've been speculating for 25 years of research is, now is this something the anterior commissure is able to supplement in some ways that you don't see a complete absence of ability to do this. You see a diminished capacity, which actually is pretty characteristic in most of what we see. We don't see very many areas where a person with ACC cannot do X. They can do X, they just can't do it very well, and they can't do it very fast. What else do we have here? What percentage of persons with ACC cases are isolated versus ACC plus? Actually, the best person to ask that is Elliot Schur. Elliot Schur is a pediatric neurologist who runs a pediatric neurology clinic. So he has lots of people coming in with various disorders. We would get in our research contact only information with isolated ACC, only persons with ICC. So I really don't have a good handle on that probabilities of being ACC plus. By the way, that's a fuzzy category of it. So person, it's what is recognizable and got documented on the MRI that was done, that ACC was noticed, is not a absolute set of criteria for ACC and ACC plus. It's somewhat fuzzy. So what we actually do is we use an IQ cutoff of 80, or this arbitrary line, but it just says that a person is functioning below 80, they may have other things going on rather than just absence of the corpus callosum. My husband uses an analogy of someone who is normal, in quotes, good, is like a 6-lane superhighway and somebody with complete ACC, like a 2-lane country road. That's a pretty good analogy. You'll get there more slowly, and some places you just may not be able to get over that road, but you don't have available the 6-lane. Oh, there's somebody interested in sharing some data. Okay. Is there a specific location the anterior commissure is located? Are there heightened communication between both sides of the brain, depending on the location? No, it's in one location. You'll always see it kind of where we saw it at MRI, if it is there. Whether or not there was some speculation that with ACC, the anterior commissure gets larger, and that's some people find it, some people don't, so I'm not sure it gets larger. There's always the question, does the anterior commissure connect up differently when the corpus callosum isn't there than when it is there? Is it making some compensatory connections in order to enhance processing when the corpus callosum is absent? And nobody knows that yet right now. So we are basically stuck with the hypothesizing that what can be done interhemispherically in a person with ACC is probably being done by the anterior commissure. The cerebral cortex we're talking about, by the way, is set over subcortical structures. And the subcortical structures are not different in ACC. The corpus callosum is a cortical structure. There's all kinds of very sophisticated things going on subcortically. So there's all kinds of subcortical movement nuclei, and those have interhemispherical right-left side coordinations and some primitive visual things. And so there's things called a hippocampal commissure that has to do with, it's a subcortical commissure, goes back and forth between sides. It's subcortical going between the hippocampus on the right, hippocampus on the left. Those are subcortical structures. So just kind of keep in mind that some of the explanation of what's going on that can be done comparing the two sides or information on the two sides or whatever could be going through subcortical pathways. I think I answered that. Do you have suggestions for someone with complete ACC who thinks of himself as creative? Let me tell you a story about creativity. There's a standard test of creativity that we did on persons with ACC. And it didn't really turn out that they scored in a less creative range, with except for one dimension, which was usefulness of the creativity. Mostly that is a Torrance test. Mostly the Torrance test is divergent thinking. Divergent thinking is just coming up with a lot of divergent things. And the question is, how linked are those divergencies to what might be a problem that you're trying to creatively solve? And so there is a version of creativity that's not ruled out by ACC, but it's more on the way we've encountered it. It's more on the lines of being able to kind of think divergently in ways that are not strongly anchored to the core, which like the story or the animation that had a core that the elaborative thinking needed to be built around, and not, you don't want to be going off, but just divergent thinking. Yeah, there's more to be said about creativity than exactly that. Can the normal corpus callosum disintegrate as we age? Can this lead to dementia? I don't think so. But remember, the corpus callosum is just axons that are connecting areas that are processing. And what happens in dementia, particularly Alzheimer's dementia, is a breakdown of some of the structure in the cerebral, the gray matter, the cerebral cortex. So if that is broken down, then what's going across the corpus callosum is going to be affected by the dementia occurring in the cerebral cortex. So they're not unrelated, but specifically the corpus callosum, in any way that I know of, this may change in the future, is not being affected by aging or dementia. At least being an old guy, I hope it's not affected by aging. Any link between other neurological diseases such as dementia and Parkinson's disease? Not that I know of. There are some other disorders where the integrity of white matter is compromised, and that would impact the corpus callosum, but not specifically. So we'll kind of hold that in advance for future research. Given your years of research, what are you looking to gain more information on next? What questions are you looking to answer? In that sort of associated symptoms, other kinds of things, there's a lot yet to be paid attention to. So the most recent thing my students and I have done, Nate did some of this recently, is to look at aesthetic processing and the music and the visual arts area. How do persons with ACC experience visual art and musical passages? We've also been interested in, we've used tests out of moral philosophy called moral dilemmas. And we're really kind of interested in, there's a lot of philosophy out there about how people solve these moral dilemmas. And we're kind of interested in how do persons with ACC solve moral dilemmas. So that's another place we go. And if you're a philosopher, persons with ACC tend to be deontological and not utilitarian. So you can go look that up. What age are the participants in our study? Most of what I was work done with adults. So that's usually about 17 or 18 and up. But we do have work on children. That's a really important issue. And so, for example, Allie out at our table is working on completing some work we started earlier on memory in children with agenesis of the Corpus Callosum. So if you have somebody between like 6 and 15 here, and you can take them by the table and put up with Allie. Allie would love to do the memory test with him. Yeah.
Have you ever done a study on people who are 65, who are 60, 65, 70, and are only now getting diagnosed?
We have not studied that. We have run into that issue of that. We met a couple of people who spent their whole life with agenesis of the Corpus Callosum, didn't know they had it, and later in life figured out they had it. And mostly it was a kind of, oh, okay, that explains a lot of my life for me. But we have not been able to study that. That's a really interesting question to me. So probably our study groups have gone up to about 50, 55, somewhere there max. Most of them in the middle or early adulthood. But it's a really interesting question, and it has to do with the question about dementia. How do persons with ACC age? Because a lot of things happen aging-wise, and so that's a really good question.
And you have no answer to that.
I have no answer. No answer.
So what am I supposed to do?
Whatever people were doing 25 years ago who had agenesis of the Corpus Callosum, and we had none of this research available. You just try to do the best you can in life. And but I think you raised like a really, really good question, because I'm getting old. I realize that my cognitive processing speed is not what it used to be. And my ability to multitask, that is, do complex things all at once, is not quite as sharp as it used to be. So it's a good question to me. How does that process that all of us go through gets affected by absence of the corpus callosum? Yeah.
Question I ask is, I'm 77.
Yeah.
When's my future?
I don't know. That's good, really good question. You're going to have to live it and tell us. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's, and that's, to be perfectly honest, 25 years ago, I met families who had my first two families we studied 25 years ago had two sons who were teenagers who had ACC, and there was nobody able to tell them anything. And I got these two families together for lunch, and they sat there across the table doing, your son does that too? I thought that was just my son's problem. And there's just all this stuff going on. I was writing notes like crazy because there was nothing out there to tell families about the neuropsychological possibilities and problems associated with agenesis of the corpus callosum. And we're kind of in that stage right now with aging, because what we've done, and has to do with convenience and where you can get persons to participate in studies, is work mostly from about 17, 18 to somewhere up around 50. And we've done some work with children, we've done no work for people above. But it does highlight for me and for us the issues that were present in this field some time ago in terms of what people knew and what they didn't do. The interesting thing about our work 25 years ago was about when neuroradiology MRIs became readily available. So to excuse the field prior to that time is you couldn't get patients to study because people weren't getting MRIs. That's the primarily way that you recognize the absence of the corpus callosum. Fortunately, me and my lab got involved in this right about the time that everybody was getting, a lot of people were getting MRIs. And some of the participants we ended up studying were persons who found out they had agenesis of the corpus callosum fortuitously. They got in an automobile accident or something, had a MRI, diagnosed with, nothing's wrong with the brain, but did you know that you're missing your corpus callosum? And then once they found out that, was there no information available to figure out what was possible. Yeah.
I'd like to questions and I wanted to the top. I apologize. So
You're going to have to talk loud.
Question somebody asked, I voted for it, so I bumped it up to the top. Can you
Oh,
go back and
okay.
answer?
So I go up to the top.
Is it possible to exercise the brain?
Is it possible to exercise? Okay. Exercising the brain basically means learning. And definitely persons with agenesis of the corpus callosum learn, for sure. And one of the things that I advise is look at the person, your family member with ACC is going to have a hard time with complex, novel problem solving. So figure out how to make the problems less novel. So learn how to cope with that area of complexity. So when you encounter it, you can know what it is that needs to be done more on a habit basis than on a figure it out at the moment. So develop a lot of, my suggestion is, work on, particularly in social processing, which are the most complex things, just work on habitual social skills. And that's as good at exercising the brain as I can imagine.
There's two more questions. I got to go through the top.
Okay. Well, the top one I have is on heterotopia. We talked about that. We talked about advances in technology. Maybe they're at the bottom on what I'm looking at.
It's the one about depth.
About what?
Depth perception.
Oh, depth perception. We have not studied depth perception. Depth of perception does take some integration of what we're seeing with the right and left eye. But the right, and it's the issue with what's in one hemisphere and the other is not right and left eye. The issue is what is, if you take the midline, what is in this half of the visual field, which goes to this hemisphere, what's in this half, which goes to this hemisphere. And depth perception is something we can do within each visual field by the information coming from that side of the visual field through both eyes, each eye, and from that side of the visual field through each eye. So it's a kind of a complicated pathway, but it basically, the information available for depth perception ought to be available for each hemisphere uniquely within that side of it. I think we've probably run out of question time, and I am around. My students are around the table up there. that says Travis Institute. You can talk to those graduate students if you can't find me. So thank you very much.